moved into my new apartment at the start of autumn. The place was small but cozy, just perfect for me. It was a quiet building, mostly elderly people or young professionals, and everyone kept to themselves. At first, I loved the peace and quiet, but that changed soon after I noticed something strange about my downstairs neighbor. I'd been in the apartment for a week before I even saw him. One night, I heard footsteps coming from below. It was odd because his unit was directly below mine, but he sounded like he was pacing in circles, never stopping, never slowing. The pacing went on for hours. At first, I thought it was just a restless night for him, but it kept happening every night, almost like a ritual. One evening, I passed him in the hallway. He was an older man with a weathered face and dark eyes that seemed to hold something unsettling. He didn't smile or say hello. He just looked at me, his gaze lingering a little too long before he turned away. I felt a chill, an unexplainable sense of dread, but I brushed it off. A few days later, I was taking out the trash when I noticed him standing by the basement door. It was an old, heavy door with a lock, and tenants didn't have access to it. I always assumed it was for storage or maintenance, but he was standing there, keys in hand, staring at the door as if he were deciding whether or not to go inside. When he saw me, he quickly pocketed the keys and hurried down the hallway without a word. I couldn't shake the strange feeling his behavior gave me. I started to notice other odd things too, things I'd previously dismissed. Every morning there was a faint smell like old damp soil that seemed to waft up from the vents. Sometimes I'd hear muffled sounds coming through the floor at odd hours, sounds I couldn't quite identify. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow him, hoping to find out what was in the basement. I waited until I heard his familiar footsteps passing by my door. I peeked out and saw him shuffling toward the basement, holding the keys in his hand and glancing around to make sure no one was watching. I followed him as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. He unlocked the basement door, slipped inside, and pulled it shut. I crept forward, pressing my ear against the door, straining to hear. At first there was silence. Then I heard the faintest whispering like he was talking to someone, or something. The door was cracked open just slightly, enough for me to risk a quick peek. My hands were shaking and every instinct told me to turn back, but I leaned in just far enough to catch a glimpse. The basement was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb, casting strange shadows on the walls. My neighbor was standing in the middle of the room, but he wasn't alone. I could barely make it out, but there was something on the floor in front of him, a mound of dirt. And in the dim light, I could see what looked like bones sticking out from the pile. He was muttering under his breath, his hands reaching out toward the dirt mound as though in prayer or supplication. His voice grew louder, and I caught fragments of words. Forgive. Release. Not yet. A floorboard creaked beneath me and he froze, his head snapping up toward the door. I stumbled back, heart racing as he called out, his voice echoing in the hallway. Who's there? I ran up the stairs and back to my apartment, slamming the door and locking it behind me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my mind racing with images of what I'd seen. Bones, dirt, his chanting. The next morning I tried to act normal, telling myself I had imagined it, that maybe I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. But when I walked by his door on the way to work, I noticed something disturbing. There were dirt stains on his doormat, a small pile of what looked like soil, and the faint, unmistakable smell of decay. I reported it to the building manager, but he seemed dismissive, saying the basement was just for storage and that my neighbor had been a resident for years without issue. When I insisted, he promised to look into it, but nothing changed. For the next few nights, I barely slept, jumping at every sound, every creak. I could still hear the strange noises from below, and I knew he was down there, doing something in that basement. Finally, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and decided to stay with a friend for a while. The last thing I saw as I was leaving was my neighbor standing by his window, watching me with that same unnerving stare. I moved out the following month. To this day, I don't know what he was doing in that basement. I don't know who or what he was talking to, and I don't want to know. I just hope that whatever he buried down there stayed buried. When I first moved into my apartment, I was thrilled. It was in a quiet neighborhood with a nice view of the park, and it had huge windows that filled the rooms with sunlight. It was a charming, cozy space, and I felt lucky to have found it. But within a few weeks, I realized that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Across the street in a small, rundown building, there was an apartment directly facing mine. The building looked deserted, old, and neglected, and I never saw anyone go in or out. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see on a ghost hunting show. Cracked windows, peeling paint, shadows lurking in every corner. One night as I was settling in to watch TV, I noticed something in the window of the apartment across from me. There was a dim light, barely visible through the grime-covered glass. Squinting, I realized there was someone standing there, just barely visible. A man, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. At first I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just looking out at the view. But then I noticed something strange. He wasn't just standing by the window. He was facing directly into my apartment, staring right at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he couldn't actually see me through the reflection. But every time I looked back, he was still there, motionless, his figure barely illuminated by the faint light behind him. I closed the curtains, trying to ignore the unease that settled over me. But the next night, it happened again. I'd forgotten about him as I got ready for bed, and when I looked out the window, there he was, standing in exactly the same spot, staring into my apartment. I closed the curtains quickly, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, and that he wanted me to know it. It was like a game, and I was the unwilling participant. Over the next few days, his presence became a constant in my life. No matter the time of day or night, if I opened my curtains, he'd be there, standing perfectly still, staring at me. I never saw him move, never saw him leave. I tried to get a better look, but the dirt and grime on his window made it impossible to make out any details of his face. All I could see was his silhouette, that tall, thin figure framed against the murky light. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a closer look from outside. I walked across the street, feeling my heart race as I got closer to the building. It was even more rundown up close. The windows were thick with dust and the lobby looked abandoned, as though no one had stepped foot in there for years. I looked up at the window where I'd seen the man, but now the room was completely dark. There was no sign of him, no light, no movement, just a cold, empty silence. I stared at the window for a few moments, feeling foolish for coming out here in the middle of the night. But as I turned to leave, I felt something shift in the air behind me. I glanced back up and my stomach dropped. He was there, standing in the window, staring down at me. His face was just barely visible now, pressed up against the glass, pale and expressionless. His eyes were dark, like two empty pits, and his mouth was stretched into a strange, unnatural grin. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I didn't dare look out the window again that night. I felt like he was right outside, watching, waiting. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a trick of the light, maybe just my imagination getting the best of me. But when I went to open my curtains, I froze. There, taped to my window, was a piece of paper with a single word written on it in messy, childlike handwriting. "Hello." My hands shook as I tore the paper down, glancing over at the apartment across the street. The window was empty again. No sign of him. No trace that he'd ever been there. But I knew it hadn't been a dream. He'd been here, close enough to touch my window, close enough to leave that message. That night I kept my curtains tightly closed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind, every distant sound. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint tapping on my window, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I stayed frozen, too terrified to move, hoping it was just my imagination. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, as though he knew I was inside, listening, cowering in fear. Eventually, the sound stopped, and silence fell over the apartment. I lay awake for the rest of the night, clutching my phone, ready to call for help. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I finally dared to peek outside. The street was empty, quiet, like nothing had happened. But when I looked across at his window, my blood went cold. There, taped to his side of the glass, was another piece of paper with the same word, written in that same messy scrawl. "Hello." I moved out of that apartment the next day. I couldn't stay there, couldn't bear the thought of living with him watching me from across the street. I don't know who or what he was, but I never looked back. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about him. I wonder if he's still there, standing in that window, waiting for someone new to move in, waiting for his next hello. When I first moved into the building, I quickly realized I was one of the youngest tenants there. Most of my neighbors were older, retired people who kept to themselves. The only other person my age was a woman named Lena, who lived across the hall in 9B. I'd see her sometimes in the hallway or the laundry room, always wearing oversized sunglasses, her hair pulled back tightly. She was polite but distant, never one for small talk, but I kept noticing strange things. Almost every night I'd hear muffled sounds coming from her apartment, heavy thuds, frantic shuffling, sometimes even what sounded like muffled sobs. Once I swear I heard her talking to someone, her voice low and tense, but when I'd listened closer, there was never another voice answering, just Lena speaking in hushed tones to the empty air. At first I figured she was just a little eccentric. Everyone in the building said she'd been living there for years and mostly kept to herself. But the noises kept coming, and soon I couldn't ignore them. One night I heard a loud crash from her apartment, followed by what sounded like faint crying. My curiosity finally got the better of me, and I knocked on her door. The sound stopped immediately, and there was a long, tense silence before the door finally creaked open. Lena looked at me, her face pale and tight with anxiety. She was wearing her sunglasses, even though it was the middle of the night. Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She paused, as if considering how much to tell me. Then she gave a small, tight smile. "Yes, just a little accident. I'm fine. Thank you for checking." She started to close the door, but I couldn't help myself. "Are you sure? It sounded like something fell, or..." "I'm fine." She cut me off, her tone final. The door shut in my face, leaving me standing alone in the dark hallway. After that, the sound seemed to get worse. I heard her pacing in the dead of night, her footsteps quick and nervous. There were more muffled conversations, though she always seemed to be the only one speaking. I started to wonder if maybe she was hiding something, or someone, in her apartment. A few days later, I ran into the building's janitor, Mr. Coe, an old man who'd worked there for decades. When I mentioned Lena, he gave me a strange look. "You're talking about Lena in 9B?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "She's an odd one, that's for sure." "Do you know if she lives with anyone?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not that I know of. As far as I can tell, she's always been alone. But that woman, she's been through some things." I pressed him for more details, but he just shook his head. "It's not my place to say. But if you ask me, sometimes people carry ghosts with them, things they can't get rid of." He gave me a knowing look and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I could hear Lena's voice, muffled but frantic, almost like she was pleading with someone. I was starting to worry that she really wasn't okay, that maybe something terrible was happening in that apartment. I knew I shouldn't intrude, but I felt a strange responsibility to check on her again. I knocked on her door, my heart pounding. This time, the door opened slowly, and Lena stood there, looking even more disheveled than before. She was still wearing those sunglasses, even though her apartment was dark. "Lena, I'm worried about you," I said softly. Is there something going on? Do you need help?" She stared at me for a long time, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she reached up and took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, dark circles etched beneath them. But that wasn't what shocked me. Her right eye was swollen and bruised, the skin purple and raw. I could barely hide my reaction, my stomach turning with horror. "Lena, what happened to you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She just shook her head, putting a finger to her lips. "He doesn't like it when I talk to other people," she murmured, barely audible. My blood ran cold. I felt like I'd stumbled onto something I shouldn't have seen, a glimpse into some private nightmare. "Who?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Who doesn't like it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she backed into her apartment and shut the door quietly, leaving me standing there in shock. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing with questions. If she was in trouble, I couldn't just leave her like that. I decided that the next morning I'd call the police and let them handle it. When morning came, I headed straight to the building's front office to tell the manager. He listened patiently as I explained my concerns, nodding along with a serious expression. Finally, he agreed to send someone up to check on her. A few hours later, I saw 2 police officers heading toward her apartment. I waited anxiously, hoping they'd be able to help her, that they'd find a way to get her out of whatever situation she was in. But when they returned, their faces were unreadable. "Did you find her?" I asked, barely able to contain my worry. One of the officers glanced at me, then looked down at his notes. "Ma'am, we spoke to the tenant of 9B. Ms. Lena Williams hasn't lived there for several years." My heart skipped a beat. "What? But I just spoke to her last night. She was right there." The officer shook his head. "We checked the records and we spoke to the building staff. Lena Williams passed away in that apartment almost 5 years ago. No one's lived there since." I felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over me. "But that's impossible. I've seen her. I've heard her. She was there. She even had bruises on her face." The officer gave me a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Sometimes people see things in old buildings like this. Memories, echoes, especially if they're looking for answers." I left the office in a daze, my mind reeling. I had been talking to Lena for weeks, hearing her through the walls, witnessing her suffering. But if she was already gone, then what had I really seen? That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps, pacing back and forth, a muffled voice pleading through the walls. I lay there frozen as the realization sank in. Lena wasn't the one haunting that apartment. It was her suffering that lingered, an endless loop of torment replaying itself, waiting for someone to notice. And now every night I hear her there calling out, begging for someone to help her escape the nightmare she could never leave behind.